Nothing is capturing the attention of Canadians more right now than President Trump. In November, he threatened tariffs day one of his presidency on Canada and Mexico due to drug and migrant flows across the border. That didn't quite materialize, but efforts have been underway since then to develop a Canada response. As it is getting formalized, it is one that is not reflective of Trump 2.0, but more importantly, it is not necessarily in the best interests of Alberta. Premier Danielle Smith has been championing a different approach, one that the Business Council of Alberta agrees with. Let's start with diplomacy, dial down the temperature, tackle the irritants, and start from that basis. She met with President Trump before inauguration and was in D.C. for a host of meetings the week of. We're honored to have Premier Smith join us on today's podcast to share her views, current efforts, what she feels might be next in this dynamic situation, and more. Premier, thank you for joining us for this important discussion.
My pleasure.
Premier, first off, thank you. Thank you for your efforts, for your position, your approach. We agree with you 100%. We're alongside you in your efforts. I know you've swam against the stream with respect to many of your peers and the federal government, but on behalf of the Alberta business community, thank you. We applaud your leadership, we applaud your courage, and we look forward to working with you on this important topic.
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess the way I look at it is that we have such a wonderful, longstanding relationship with the United States. And from time to time, you're going to end up with some skirmishes and some disagreements, but you don't blow up an entire relationship on the basis of some short term problems. So diplomacy should always be first and it should be continuous. So even though we might be in for a bumpy patch here, I'm going to continue doing the reach out and making the case for Canada and making the case for how we can support the Americans and their aspirations. And I hope that we're able to make a breakthrough on that.
Well, I'm optimistic that we can. If there is a persuasive person in the province, it is you. And so I'm quite confident that people will hear your arguments and be very much persuaded by that. Based on those meetings, how would you describe the situation? What are you hearing from, you've spoken to President Trump himself before inauguration. You've spoken with many of his cabinet, with legislators across the states. How would you describe the situation?
I think that there's a few things that we're trying to get to the bottom of, which is the tariffs being threatened for their own sake as a revenue generator and as a way to protect and shore up American industry, or is it a means to something else? I mean, I think we saw it just in the last couple of days with the issues with Colombia. Tariffs were rolled out as a way to get a solution on deporting Colombians back to that country. And as soon as that was agreed, the threat was off the table. So that's why it's difficult to know whether or not the tariff threat is about tariffs and about trade, or if it's about the NATO commitment, or if it's about border security, or if it's about something else altogether. And so I don't think we'll know until we see what happens on February the 1st. I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to avoid tariffs and get back to having a constructive conversation about the joint issues that we share.
Do you think this is going to be a matter of trying a few solutions to address the irritants? So tackling some things on the border, tackling some things on the drug side, tackling some of the defense spend, and just seeing how he responds? Or do you think there's a different strategy we can take?
There's a couple of things that I took away, and mostly it comes from watching the confirmation hearing of Doug Burgum, who's going to be the Interior Secretary. Interesting. I was listening to the hearings. I thought, my goodness, he's responsible for something that I have distributed between 7 different ministries. So it really is going to be the energy czar, I think, as it's been called colloquially, and he'll be leading an energy council. But one of the things that came out clearly is that the Americans want to be dominant. They want to have energy dominance. And really, it's up to us to make the argument that the only way they can achieve that is with the help of Canadian oil and gas. Part of the reason why the Americans are able to export their WTI is because we backfill, and we backfill to refineries that are configured specifically to receive our particular type of heavy oil because it's more efficient to do so and it can make more of the products that they need. So that's why I think we have a very strong argument to make that if the Americans want to export more, then they really should be importing more from us. That's one part of it. And the other thing that I think I have a better appreciation for is that the Americans do not want to lose the AI race to China. And if you think about what it would mean if AI dominance happened in a totalitarian communist regime like China, what that would mean for the world, I can see why they're nervous about that. One of the things that I had learned is that China is building coal plants just on spec, not turning them on, but in anticipation of the extra power that they're going to need to be able to fuel the AI growth. Whereas here we are in North America, difficult to get a transmission line built, difficult to get a power plant approved. We're shutting off certain types of electricity. So that's a major recalibration that people need to do as well, is that how do we make sure that we support that AI development for our own collective security and what that looks like, all of the different electricity sources being on deck. I think that's going to be increasingly important. But more than that, we're not just a supply chain for food and timber and auto parts and oil and gas. We're also a supply chain for critical minerals, which are going to be increasingly important. And every province has a good story to tell. If we can get our permitting and timeframe issues sorted out, then we can be the secure supplier of all of those vital resources to the United States to fuel both of those booms. So I think we've got a good collaboration and a good argument to make. That being said, for the last 10 years, we've been going in the exact opposite direction, not building pipelines,
Yeah.
having aggressive policies aimed to keep oil and gas in the ground, not permitting, and wanting to see some of the coal plants being shut down, natural gas plants not being permitted. That's why I think we're a bit at odds. We're operating under a 10-year-old paradigm, and the Americans have switched. They've done a 180, and we need to catch up and figure out a way that we can support them in their aspirations if we want to keep this huge economic relationship tariff-free.
hmm I think Canada has made its bed in the situation that we find ourselves in with respect to not building the infrastructure that would get to other markets, being so reliant on the United States. I completely agree. I think if you strip out the notion of him using this as a revenue generating tool, I think you're viewing it accurately in the sense that wrapping it all into the notion of security, national security for food, for energy, critical minerals, other supply chain elements. Is that argument resonating with the conversations you're having in the States? And are you finding that there is an appreciation of the depth of our trade relationship, or are some people coming away saying, "Oh, that's new information. I didn't really know that."
There's a few things that I think might be unfamiliar to the Americans. And one of the advantages of being a province rather than a state is that we own our resources and
hmm
we control a lot of the permitting process for the projects that take place within our territories, which in theory means that we should be able to move faster on some of these things if we're going to be making commitments. So that's one part. The other thing I'd say is that I do keep hearing about the frustration on Arctic security and the
hmm
NATO commitment. That when you think about where Donald Trump was in his first term, he told the world he wanted them all to meet the 2% target. Here he is back again, and we still don't have a plan to reach the
hmm
2% NATO commitment until 2032. And the world's become a very dangerous place. And so I think that there is going to be a need to do some serious work around Arctic security, the NATO commitment, icebreakers. When you look
hmm
at Russia has 60 icebreakers. I think the Americans have one. And that we've got a great shipbuilding industry. That's something that we can put on the table. So I think that the new conversation is to identify what is it that the Americans cannot make themselves or haven't been making themselves. What is it that they rely on us for in order to be able to achieve these aspirations? How do we fit into that? How do we continue to be their best friend? That's why I've taken a bit more of a diplomatic approach, trying to get at the root of what their aspirations are and how we can meet them. And we'll see if it has a breakthrough. I think in certain members of the administration, those arguments are going to be accepted. In other aspects of the advisors to him, the ones who love tariffs for tariff's sake, maybe not as persuasive, but I think we've got to make the argument.
Premier, do you see, are there different or new kinds of influential voices around the president? I've seen articles now talking about how close he is with the tech sector and the
Mhm.
Mark Zuckerbergs and Jeff Bezos, et cetera. You have a government to government diplomatic approach. What would you encourage organizations like us, the Business Council, and others to be doing, and who we should be talking to that you think would augment and supplement the work you're doing?
What I've noticed about this administration, which is very interesting, is there doesn't seem to be a lot of repeat faces in any of the
hmm
key positions from last
Yeah.
time, which is interesting. And part of the reason for that is a group called America First. So they
hmm
got together after the president left office the first time and said, let's try to put together a grassroots movement with a whole series of policies that he can implement and also recommendations about who the voices are, who should be. And I understand, I think they recommended 36 of the prospective appointees. So that group, I think, is going to continue to be influential and they're going to continue to grow. I went to their event and they said that they were now looking at branching out at the state level. So I think increasingly that group is going to be important. And they have two aspects, they've got a political arm and they've got a policy arm. And so if we want to see where it is that the Americans are intending to go, reading that policy document that they put together is going to be important. I am encouraged, though, that you've got two people who really understand the energy industry and Canada in particular in key roles. Chris Wright
Hmm.
from Liberty Oil, he is the American's new energy secretary, and also Doug Burgum, who former North Dakota governor, but also somebody who he was a tech billionaire in his own right. So he understands the whole picture around oil and gas as well as its integration and AI. And then you're quite right to point out it's very interesting because I think a lot of those tech bros were not
Hmm.
necessarily on the Republican team during the first part of this, but they've all come on board wanting to help. And I think it just demonstrates how seriously everybody is taking the need for technology dominance and innovation, and how vitally important it is to stay ahead on that. So finding a way that we can support that supply chain, nurture that AI development, build the electricity, provide the critical minerals, have the brilliant minds collaborating. We've got 3 different institutes in Canada
Hmm.
that do AI research, one of them right here in Alberta at the
Hmm.
University of Alberta. And that to me is going to be really where the future lies. And I think it's key to maintaining a solid relationship with the US.
Hmm. Premier, diplomacy is plan A, and we fully subscribe to that approach. We're recording this Monday, January 27th. Tariffs may come into effect on Saturday, February 1st. What do you think should be the response, the date that the potential tariffs do actually come into effect?
Yeah, if I've watched what's happened in the past and in other type of tariff skirmishes, there's always a proportionate response, and
Hmm.
I suspect that once we see what we're in for on February 1st, then that'll have to be calibrated about what our response will be here. And so we're having those conversations at the table. I don't know what it will look like. I mean, obviously the response will have to be different if it's 25% across the board versus if there are carve outs or versus if there's targeted to specific industries. I would expect that you'd see all of the premiers and the national government be in support of having some kind of proportionate response if it is the case that tariffs come in.
Hmm. When you're having conversations with your counterparts across the country, do you get a sense that there is a recognition that this is a wake up call? Are they, in addition to talking about dealing with the US, also looking at reducing interprovincial trade barriers? Are they also saying, yes, Premier Smith will support the notion of revitalizing the concepts or projects of Northern Gateway and Energy East? Are they getting a sense that past decisions were not the best for Canada and are willing
Well,
to make progress?
I can tell you, I certainly make that point that when people ask why it is that Alberta sells so much oil and gas to the United States, is because they're the only ones who would let us. And not even recently as well with the Keystone XL. But our energy industry is amazing. They found ways to expand existing pipelines and loop and compress and use rail. And so, darn it, if we didn't just become the most important exporter to the United States, we surpassed Saudi Arabia in 2014. And so our energy industry is amazing. But the reason we had to go through those lengths is because we couldn't get a Northern Gateway built and we couldn't get Energy East built. There was a decision made in the early 2000s to stop receiving Western Canadian gas because it was cheaper to get gas from the United States. And so now we're in a position where the eastern part of Canada is 100% dependent on oil and gas coming in from another jurisdiction. I'd like to solve that. I mean, we would be
Mhm.
more than happy to create another option so that they could rely on their Canadian friends and neighbors to be able to get this vital supply of product. And same thing, I would love to be able to have an avenue to export off the East Coast so that we can support our friends in Europe, and also export off the West Coast so that we can support our friends in Asia. I think that those are important aspirations to have. And by creating those supply lines, that helps others. If we can build more robust infrastructure to our northern ports, maybe Grays Bay or something else, that would help develop our critical minerals, which are wanted around the world. If we
Mhm.
could get our situation under control with airline strikes and port strikes and rail strikes so that we can provide some certainty to our buyers that they're going to get their products. I think that's another important conversation that we need to have across the country as well. And then tearing down internal trade barriers. I mean, how frustrating would it be for a transport company to start their track in Vancouver and have different rules every time they cross a border into a different province
Mhm.
about trucking rules? That's a very simple aspect. The protectionist approach that we've seen in the provinces on a whole range of crown corporations. I mean, I think Alberta actually has the least number of restrictions through internal
Yeah.
trade, but
Mhm.
we've already started the conversation. How do we have a more robust internal trade table? Can we start talking about increasing the infrastructure build or revitalizing some of those projects? I think this is our time. We have to really understand why it is we all allowed our relationship to be stronger north-south than it is east-west. If we want to succeed as a country and support each other, that is the foundational change that we've got to make.
Mm-hmm. Premier, I know that in this conversation, much of the focus is on Canada's energy products, some of the electricity and auto, but Alberta also sends a tremendous amount of agricultural product, petrochemical product. What are you seeing in the conversations you're having around the non-oil and gas side of the trade issues?
What I was pleased to see is that the American Petroleum Institute has stood up and said, look at all of the problems that America would have if we disrupted that supply chain. And I hope we start seeing other industry groups in the United States do the same thing. There are slaughter facilities in the United States that are reliant on live cattle from Canada in order to maintain not only their capacity, but also their prices. I would bet that you would be able to make that argument across every grain product that we provide to the United States as well. And so we've got to be talking to those industry associations. That's one of the things that I think I learned from my trip to America. It's one thing to talk to decision makers in Congress; they're important voices. Members of the administration, they're important voices as well. But I think we have a president who is very, very sensitive to the American job creators as well as the American workers. And so I think a lot of our commentary has to be framed that way. And if we can get those who rely on our products to create the value added, create the jobs, and lower the prices for American consumers, I think that really is the strongest case that we can make.
Yeah, and that's exactly the approach we're taking, is speaking to the organizations business-wise, the other side of the border, to be internal champions and advocates for a continued strong relationship. Premier, I know we're out of time, but any last comments you'd like to make or leave with Albertans?
I think you'll see that the premiers are going to continue meeting on a weekly basis to be able to respond to this. There will be a response if, unfortunately, it goes the direction that it appears to be heading. I believe we're all planning on going down for a delegation and mission into Washington as a group in order to collectively make the
Excellent.
arguments and hopefully meet with some of the key decision makers. But I think these are the kinds of issues that I would love for Canada to just go back to being the reliable, trustworthy neighbor. I think that the Americans have a lot of bigger fish to fry in a very dangerous world. And I think if we can make that case to them that let's solve whatever issues we have quickly so that they can get on to dealing with the bigger issues, I think that we would all benefit from that.
Premier, thank you so much for joining us, but more importantly, thank you for your efforts, your advocacy, and your leadership in this incredibly dynamic time for Alberta and for Canada. So thank you so much, and we look forward to working with you on this. Hopefully not for very long, but thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you for joining us. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB, that's B-I-Z, Council AB, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you like this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.